Hello and welcome to today's event, From Ransomware to ZeroTrust, CISO Insights in 2022. Today's webinar is sponsored by Gigamon and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media. I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation, where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio or video or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Of course, we appreciate seeing all of your hellos and hearing where you're from, so please keep those up. That's great to see. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. You've got the full 2022 CISO report that's being discussed today, also a sponsor brief from that report, and an infographic from that same report. There are also a few links to a Gigamon product tour, so a lot of great resources in there today. I encourage you to access those now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing are also in your handout section. Just scroll to the bottom there and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link. Now, we do have a poll question today before we get started, so I wanted to call your attention to that. So this is a time frame question. What's your time frame for adding new or updating existing IT solutions at your company? And we're looking for, less than half a year, up to a year to 2 years, or not sure. So I see the responses already rolling in now. Appreciate everybody who's responded already. If you haven't yet, please do respond. That does help us out a lot. And while we leave the poll question up there and give everybody a little extra time to answer it, I would like to point out one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters, who I'm going to introduce in just a second. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. Okay, and I'm just looking at the survey here. Appreciate everybody who's responded. So we'll go ahead and close that up. Thanks again to all of you who've indicated what your evaluation time frame is. That's very helpful. And with that, let's get straight to today's great discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Chris Borales, who's Senior Product Marketing Manager at Gigamon, and we have Mark Bouchard, who's CEO at AimPoint Group. So let me just welcome on Chris and Mark. Chris, great to see you. Mark, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Scott.
Well, let me turn things over to Chris to take it away.
Actually, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mark, but we'll go ahead and just talk sort of high level about some of the insights from our AimPoint Group survey here, and we'll talk through some interesting findings and also some ways that we can apply those findings through leveraging visibility and how to really tackle the sort of growing ransomware threat. So go ahead and take it away, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. So this report, our report, is different than many others because it is 100% CISO-centric, right? The survey we used to gather the data heavily influenced by a panel of CISOs. The survey respondents were all CISOs or deputy CISOs. And then to supplement the survey data, we had in-depth interviews with about a dozen CISOs. And then last but not least, our CISO panel also reviewed and approved the content for the final report. So really no surprises to them. And like I said, very much guided by them. Very much a 100% CISO-centric report. And as a result, we didn't just focus on the size and the scope of the threat landscape. There's certainly some of that here, and that's what we'll be exploring in the first set of key findings on threats and impacts. But once we get through that, we're also going to look at the flip side of the equation, so the gaps or the vulnerabilities and the risks, if you will, that are commanding the most attention these days for security teams. And we also take a look at the key obstacles that security teams are having to overcome to address those vulnerabilities, to address those risks. And in the last segment of my portion, we'll shift our attention to the solution side of the puzzle. So where are security teams focusing their efforts over the next 12 months? What is everyone doing with regard to hot topics such as ZeroTrust or hot spots in their risk profiles such as API security? And then what are the key capabilities or the key characteristics that they're looking for when they're out there shopping for new solutions? And I think along the way too, we'll hear a little bit from Chris. He's going to provide some insights from his perspective and maybe share some insights on how Gigamon can help address some of the biggest challenges, that we see out there facing today's security teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, in some ways, it's completely baffling, right? That despite all of the spending on security, all of the improvements being made, the frequency of successful attacks remains so high. And that's one of the data points that we're showing here, right? 3/4 of our responded organizations suffered at least one attack that caused material damage in the past year. And, going beyond that, more than half were hit more than once, and a very unlucky 9%, almost 10%, were hit more than 5 times over the past year by, again, an attack that caused material damage. And really only 1 in 5 or just under 20% could consider themselves lucky, right? Because they were unscathed, at least for the past year. When we dig a little bit deeper into the data, we also saw that mid-sized organizations were hit the worst or fared the worst, as 90% of them were hit at least once. And our interpretation there is that these organizations, they have plenty of valuable data and information and things that attract them to the bad guys. They have a big attack surface, but they typically lack the breadth and the depth of resources that a larger organization has. So that puts them in a bit of a tight spot, if you will. In terms of vertical segments, we saw construction and manufacturing at the top of the list being hit the hardest. Not really surprising, at least to me, because I think historically those verticals have been underfunded when it comes to security, at least compared to some of the others on the list here. You see retail and technology coming in, or they came in next. Funding is higher typically for those organizations, but they're also more attractive targets, and that's why they're pretty high in the list as well. And then a little bit oddly, at least to me, we saw European organizations being hit the most. And that's not really strange relative to US, but it is relative to Asia Pac, which is, I think, generally been regarded as the region with the least mature security infrastructure and practices. And maybe what we're seeing here, and it'll take another year of data to really suss it out, is that Asia Pacific companies are catching up and maybe passing the European ones. Another thing we asked our respondents is about their perception of the threat landscape in general now, right at this point in time, compared to a year ago. And, going into this, for some reason, I thought maybe they would think things were a little bit better because there was some fall off with regard to ransomware activity. But I think from the data, my thinking was naive or at least desensitized, right? You hear about ransomware so much, just sort of tuning it out. But basically, 70% of our audience said, hey, the threat landscape definitely worse now than it was a year ago. And I think that really leads into our key takeaways for this slide, right? We're in an arms race, and getting far enough ahead to always remain unscathed, it's not possible. And given that breaches are inevitable, we need to ensure that we're investing appropriately in ways to speed up time to detection, speed up our time to contain threats, and then also speed up remediation and restoration of normal operations. And we're going to hear this a few times, but really achieving better visibility of what infrastructure you need to defend and what exactly is happening on that infrastructure, it's imperative to achieving those goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Mark, when you talk about sort of that perception of we are so inundated by the constant message that, we have to be on the defensive, or we have to make sure that, we are prepared against these cyber attacks. But, for some of those middle-sized organizations, I think they are in, like you said, like they're in an unfortunate sweet spot where technology for the attackers are getting better at what they're doing, and they've pinpointed specific industry verticals, and they can target those verticals and get after them more because they sort of have profiles built on these organizations. They might know, where certain weaknesses are, maybe in infrastructure or in maybe they don't have necessarily monitoring of their IoT or OT devices. It's something that they know might be a particular gap in that, in that security structure, in their security posture. So then they can go ahead and target those organizations. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's been said a million times, right? The bad guys only have to get it right once. The good guys have to get it right all the time. So it's to some degree, it doesn't even matter what size of organization, where you are, what vertical you are. You got to be right every single time. Anyway, with this chart, there's a little more evidence of my, again, somewhat naive thinking as we see ransomware actually at the top of the list of threats that are keeping security leaders up at night. Some of the others that are up there, phishing, of course, always near the top of the list. We also see supply chain attacks pretty high. And, technically, those are threats in the form of compromised software libraries or compromised systems for updating your software, especially if you're talking about IT and security management tools. But I've also listed connected partners here because we saw a little bit of muddiness in our data where we think the audience was really confusing the two types of threats where, these connected partners, it's not about software. It's more about any way in which a partner connection provides an attacker for, access or an avenue into your environment.
Sure, those third parties. Yeah.
No. And then not to be overlooked too, I think there's a few types of threats. I think of them as up and coming. They're going to become more prominent going forward. Things like client-side web attacks. So most people have heard of MageCart or things like form jacking or e-skimming. OWASP has a whole new list of these types of threats that go beyond their original top 10. Very subtle, highly impactful, though, if you happen to be using dynamic web pages to enhance the user's experience, which is very often the case when you have a shopping cart, for example. And then social media poisoning also on the list. The goal there, you're going to tarnish a company's reputation by impersonating them, corrupting them, or somehow co-opting their social media presence. And I think the top really takeaway here is that with few exceptions, organizations need to spend time accounting for just about every one of these classes of threats, and probably a few more that aren't even on the list. So, go ahead. With regard to which, you have something on it?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So next we asked about impacts, and with regard to which impacts of a cyber attack cause the greatest concern, exposure of sensitive data leads the way, right? 65% of our respondents selected that option. And I think that situation has been exacerbated, no doubt, by this double barrel ransomware attack phenomena that's out there, where the threat actors are not just ransoming your sensitive data, they're also threatening to expose it. And that's, again, elevated that as a concern. And the fact that downtime for critical services comes in second on the chart, again, I don't find that one particularly surprising, given that the impacts here for downtime extend to your customers. They extend to folks or outsiders that are dependent on those services. A little bit interesting, though, is that productivity loss, right, which would be an internal consequence of downtime, actually came in last place. And presumably that's because disruption to some subset of your internal users, the thinking is that can be overcome by making up for lost time. Again, not to mention the fact that the impact isn't visible to the outside world. So it just isn't as significant to your organization. And really the bottom line here is that external impacts, right, those that are impacting folks outside the organization generally trump the internal ones. And among the internal ones, things like compliance actions or employee productivity, kind of at the bottom of the barrel, if you will. So if we shift gears a little bit now from the threat and the impact parts of the equation, these next few charts are going to focus on the vulnerabilities and then some of the more common gaps we see in organizations' defenses. And as we see here from the data, third-party risk tops the lists of weaknesses that are causing the security teams the most concern these days. And that certainly tracks, I think, with the escalation of supply chain security issues over the past 2 years. And you think about it this way, right? There are definitely some measures that you can put in place to obligate or audit third-party security practices. But at the end of the day, this vulnerability, this risk isn't completely within an organization's control, which makes it all the more challenging or at least disconcerting. Pretty close also at the top, though, is unpatched software and systems. And that is something that is within an organization's direct control. And frankly, the fact that patching is still such a high concern, it really points to the fact that more focus, more resources, and bandwidth really need to be dedicated to this practice, right? It's another thing, just added on the list of CISO's tasks, but it is one of utmost importance.
Can I mention something to that point, Mark, real quick? Please. About the unpatched software. What I think is interesting with this one, this is really an interesting area where you have the security concern, obviously, but it might not necessarily be in the realm of the CISO. They might be beholden to the sort of the CIO or the IT team in order to run these patches, to make sure that the software is updated. So you have this sort of, in some organizations, there might be some friction between the two organizations, but you still have, but then you have this sort of like shared responsibility of, your InfoSec team sort of having to influence outside of what their normal swim lane is. And you want to make sure that these organizations are, they're playing nice together. And I think, having some, having additional visibility into that, or being able to sort of democratize this data is good for the organization as a whole. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but
absolutely. And you said might be some friction. I think it's more common than not, right? And to your point too, also high on our list was configuration errors made by IT admins. And IT admins aren't necessarily security. So sometimes they're creating the security problem and not helping in any constructive way to fix it. So definitely a politics and culture issue that needs to be overcome there.
Absolutely.
So, moving on a little bit, we asked CISOs to identify we call it infrastructure components, right? The piece of their environment that's most in need of further investment from a security perspective. So in other words, where do they most need to shore up their defenses? And leading the way here, we saw is a couple of closely related items. So APIs, cloud apps or SaaS apps, and then other cloud services. And the relationship here is due to the fact that, pretty much cloud things of all flavors are really big on being interconnected. And the way that integration is accomplished, that interconnectedness is achieved, is APIs. And then we have another thing that's also driving the proliferation of APIs, and that's the rise of microservices-based application architectures. Right? This is where every little function of the application is broken out into, its own little mini app, if you will. And the part that it's relevant here is that the way all these little mini apps now talk to each other is APIs. So behind the scenes, essentially, for most organizations, there's this really complex, or at least increasingly complex, web of APIs that really is the backbone of all of their apps, or many of their apps, and a lot of the cloud services that they're using. And to take it further, it's pretty much like the Wild West, right? There is very little visibility into what all these connections are, who they're with, what data they have access to, and then what's being done with that data. That's the visibility side. There's also very little control over them. And it's really, I think, comes back to the classic scenario, right? The business forging ahead to meet its operational and revenue objectives, and then security having to play catch up without, ever having the opportunity to put the horse back in the barn, if you will. So are we surprised to see APIs at the top of the list? Not really. Okay. Sorry. So next we asked about what's holding organizations back from having more effective security defenses, right? And two of the top items, almost always the case, it involves people, all right? So first is the ongoing shortage of skilled security personnel. And you hear about this one all the time. So I'm not really going to beat the dead horse here. Suffice to say, it's a problem. It's not going to go away probably ever. And that really means that organizations need to find better, more efficient ways of getting security done. And I think this is a good point for organizations to really put a stake in the ground and say, hey, we're going to start trusting in and doing more with automation, right? At least intelligent automation capabilities that are out there. The second people problem is all about the users. So whether we're talking about employees or customers or constituents, whoever they are, it's all about them not being sufficiently tuned in, sufficiently trained up on their role in the security equation. And guardrails, technology, sandboxes, they're only going to get you so far. Ultimately, it does take having a culture of security to really make a difference. And it's why I find it very alarming, right? We asked another question about security processes that are most in need of attention, and user awareness and education came in absolute last place. And my advice, to organizations there is don't give up on user awareness programs. I think instead you really need to double down. The dividends are there to be had, especially if you look at the high percentage of security incidents, the high percentage of security breaches where user action or inaction is a key component, right? If you go look at the VDBIR, it's something like 75% of all breaches have a user-oriented component to them. So, I'm not a big advocate of giving up there. And then just in case you're... Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Mark. I was just going to say, it's where you get your most bang for your buck. It probably costs a whole lot less to develop that security awareness program than it is to cultivate a new team of threat hunters or whatever it happens to be that you're looking for. But it makes sense.
Yeah. In case you're wondering too about the last bullet on the left side here, what I'm getting at is that although board of directors have gotten more generous towards security over the past couple of years, and a lot of this I think stems from the high profile nature of ransomware attacks, I do expect this attention to come with a not so silver lining. And specifically what I'm getting at here is that reporting to the board in terms that make sense to them, right? In terms that clearly quantify risks and returns and impacts, that's going to be the next requirement and the next big challenge for many security leaders out there. I'm not saying that some haven't already figured it out, but they're very much in the minority. And this is going to become increasingly important going forward. And I can't see very well, Chris. Are we on the right slide or am I one behind?
Oh, we're good. You're good.
All right. So top priorities and initiatives. So, shifting focus a little bit, these next three slides are all about plans and priorities. So given the threats, the vulnerabilities, the obstacles we just talked about, what does CISOs intend to do next? And top priority at a macro level, better ensuring the privacy of customer data. And I got to say this, I think it's certainly a sensible objective, but I am going to caution you that it can also lead to some unexpected complications for security, which sounds ironic, right? But think about it this way. You may think you're doing everyone a favor by encrypting more of your network traffic, more of your data, and so forth. But if you're not careful, the result can be a lot of blind spots where your monitoring tools, your prevention tools, your detection solutions, they're kept from doing their jobs as thoroughly as they otherwise could. And then you start thinking about decryption and doing decryption at scale. So I guess the caution there is, yes, we want to do a better job of ensuring privacy. If you're going to do it with encryption, you need to go in with your eyes wide open as to how that's going to impact the rest of your security infrastructure. Also high on our list is ZeroTrust. We're going to dive into that again in a couple of minutes. And then there's the intent to better address those third-party supplier risks, which we saw at the top of our vulnerability concerns. So that makes pretty good sense. I thought interesting in the middle of the pack here, better measuring security program effectiveness, right? That ties into my point I just made a few seconds ago about the growing need to communicate to the board in terms that they understand. And then also kind of interesting at the bottom of the list, right? Better securing the remote and hybrid workforce. Presumably that's at the bottom because we spent so much time and effort on it over the past 2 years, right? It's not that it's not important. It's just that we've focused on it heavily in the past 2 years. And then, vendor consolidation. This is an interesting one, right? We hear a lot of noise from security teams about wanting to simplify their tool sets. But when push comes to shove, it really looks like from the data that effectiveness is still the top dog, right? It takes priority over the potential to reduce complexity or to reduce the operational inefficiencies that come from having a lot of disparate tool sets. Anything you want to add there, Chris?
No, I was going to say that what I do find interesting is the measuring program effectiveness. I do think that's going to be an interesting thing down the road. That if you can being able to communicate that effectiveness, like you said, sort of manage up, it is going to be a key skill set for a CISO moving forward. You need to be able to have those board level conversations. This is not something that Gigamon directly affects, but it is definitely something that it's a skill set that's going to be needed moving forward for sure.
Yeah, and I encourage folks to go and download the report, see it for themselves, because we actually have a section in there. We asked specifically about how well, what their capability was for quantifying, the return on investment for a security purchase, or quantifying the degree of risk that they have. And the results were pretty much mediocre to poor in terms of being able to actually, put dollar values or some kind of, quantitative figure associated with those, risks and returns. So yeah, it's definitely an intractable. It's a significant problem. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, for sure.
So moving on, two more from my section before we really hand it over to Chris. I'm not going to preach to you about the values of ZeroTrust and a ZeroTrust security model. You can find that elsewhere. I think there's a lot been written about it. My opinion, frankly, it's the right way to do security, especially for the modern computing environment where people, the devices, the apps, they're no longer constrained to a single trusted location, right? They can be anywhere, and they are anywhere. They're all over the place. And I think that's backed up by the data that we uncovered, showing that nearly everyone out there is either planning to or already has implemented a zero-trust security model for their organization. What I will say, though, is that implementing zero-trust is not quick and easy. It's not something you're going to do overnight. It's a journey, and frankly, I think it's one that's never going to end. And to see what I mean here, let's break it down a little bit. It starts with robust verification of who or what is trying to use a computing resource. So for humans, that means multi-factor authentication. And ideally, it means multi-factor authentication that is easy to implement and also frictionless to use. And in that regard, I like to point people to the new generation of passwordless MFA solutions that are popping up out there. Now, from there, ZeroTrust is really about two more things. So the next one is having no default or open communication pathways from users to systems or from one system to another, right? All paths, all connections need to be explicitly provisioned and allowed. And this is really instrumental to preventing unauthorized access. And, we always hear about lateral movement. This is the way we stop lateral movement, okay? Or unauthorized lateral movement. And the solutions we're talking about here generally are segmentation, micro-segmentation, and things like that. And then last but not least, ZeroTrust is all about having no default permissions. So what we're doing then is taking this principle of least privileges all the way to the individual apps and all the way to the data level. And this, my friends, this is the part of the journey that's never going to end. All right. So first, I'm not aware of any tools out there that support this piece of the puzzle, at least not with the scope and the scale that most organizations need. But beyond that, our attack surface, those things that we need to provide permissions and authorizations to, it's always changing and it's almost always growing. And that's why I mean by it's never, you're never going to end this journey. I don't want to get stuck there. And I said last but not least, but there's actually another capability that I think is imperative to making all of this happen, and that's comprehensive visibility, right? How are you going to establish, how are you going to monitor, how are you going to enforce all of this more granular control over your computing environment if you can't actually see everything that's happening in the computing environment? You can't, right? At least not in a meaningful way, not in a way that is, not haphazard and wasteful. All right. And before I hand it, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to make one thing, Mark. It's all right. No worries. I was going to say just exactly to your point. We have that sort of, yes, multi-factor authentication is 100%. It is necessary to, and your identity access management, 100% necessary for that zero trust model. But then when you talked about some of the points you talked about earlier with the proliferation of APIs, cloud resources, et cetera, those do come with some they come with defaults that might not be in the organization's best, security interest. You might be able to provision one of these cloud environments and give full, are you giving full open internet access to the developer? Are you exposing customer data inadvertently through some permissions level that you might have unlocked in your AWS environment? That's something we got to take into account and make sure that this is not something that's sort of on by default. You got to make sure that you have, a good handle on what permissions you're giving along, for these cloud assets that you're that we are sort of we are encouraged to to be agile, et cetera. So we want to make sure that we have resources available, but on the same side, you want to make sure that you're sort of practicing best practices when
something else you touched on there too is it's not just about users to systems. I mean, you brought up the APIs. Ultimately, we need to get control over app to app and system to system and all of that as well. So again, it's just more evidence that implementing zero trust, it's definitely the right way to go, but it's going to be a heck of a journey to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So, last set of findings we have here have to do with the capabilities and the characteristics that CISOs are looking for when they're out shopping for new security solutions. And overall, the way I'd summarize it is that they're looking for solutions that are streamlined and efficient, but are still top quality, right? So 62% said, hey, we want solutions that are easy to deploy. Why? Well, because of the complexity in their environments already and how much they already have to do on their plates. Along the same lines, right, we see ease of use. That was second on the list. And then in fourth place, right, automation gaining ground too. I think automation, it's a hard pill to swallow. For a long time, organizations were afraid of what automation might disrupt. And then there was fear of losing their jobs, machines replacing humans. But I think a lot of that is diminishing, or at least the problem is getting so great that it's on a relative basis, it's diminishing. Best of breed solutions, if you look on the chart here, it actually rates higher than being part of a broader platform. And I think, pretty clear again that demand for effectiveness exceeds the desire for, convenience and potentially lowering complexity. And I want to be careful though, because it certainly doesn't mean that a platform approach shouldn't be considered. I think ultimately, these broader platforms should be able to achieve pretty high degrees of effectiveness if all of the parts are actually working together. And that's a big if. I mean, that's, capital IF. And the challenge though is, as evaluators, you're like, hey, when does the improved effectiveness great enough to tip the scales away from the alternative, which is that less efficient adoption of so-called best of breed solutions? And that's a dynamic I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon for either the sellers or the buyers of the solutions that are out there.
Well, one thing I'm curious to ask you about this, Mark, regarding sort of implicit trust and zero trust models. If you do go with the platform approach, are you giving over too much implicit trust to the vendors that you're sort of interlocked in, or you're trusting? Is it better to have that sort of best of breed to where you are able to work with multiple vendors so that you aren't, sort of vendor lock-in, and avoiding that sort of risk there?
Yeah, and I don't know that I'd put it in trust terms. It's more about, effectiveness and what your priorities are as an organization. Most organizations are trying to get the most effective security solutions they can, and they're willing to give up a little bit in terms of complexity or efficiency to get there. And that's what we're seeing with the data. And my point is, when are the scales going to tip the other way? When are the platforms going to become, close enough in terms of effectiveness that having a best of breed solution doesn't make a difference anymore? We're not there in general, but we're always getting closer.
Yeah, fair. Mm-hmm.
And then just real quick word on the last point I want to make, number 3 on the list here, high fidelity alerts and analysis. Again, I want to emphasize that that's important, but the only way it can be achieved is by all the right security data being made available to all of the right security tools, and in an efficient and cost-effective manner, so that we can overcome some of the complexity out there. So that's my last setup for you and Gigamon. Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you right now.
Well, thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it. We're going to jump around a little bit, and I think you so eloquently discuss visibility and the importance of it especially when we have these sort of complex environments and we're distributed over various regions globally, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the what the cloud environment looks like, what this environment looks like. So we have all of these sort of disparate systems that Mark had been mentioning, where we have application servers. You can see on the left-hand side of this slide, there's data going to all of these tools that you see on the right. And really, the need is, because visibility is sort of such a foundational need when we're talking about sort of network efficiency, performance, et cetera, even in maintaining security, we want to make sure that we have, some way to essentially streamline all of this data to make sure that it's going to the right place at the right time. And this is what, on the Gigamon side, we call a deep observability pipeline. This is really enabling any workload you can see there on the left going to any tool that you see on the right. And what we want to be able to do with this pipeline is we want to be able to access data as necessary. We want to be able to broker that data and send it to where it needs to go to. If we need to transform it, meaning if we need to one of Mark's points regarding encryption, if we need to decrypt data that we want to make sure goes to a security tool for an efficiency, to be more efficient, if we need to decrypt that data and then re-encrypt it as it goes out of the network, we can do that. If we need to deduplicate any data through the network, we need to do that. And lastly, we need to be able to investigate that data as it goes through the entire pipeline to make sure that there is no malicious activity, there is no anomalous activity going on. So this deep observability pipeline from Gigamon allows organizations to do this on a foundational level. So when we talk about it from a security perspective and how these tools typically roll out, what I typically do, we're looking at it from the terms of a SOC, or a security operations center. So when we take a look at a SOC, what we're doing is we see down there at the bottom, we have the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So if we take a look through the lens of the MITRE ATT&CK framework and we're looking at how we're going to implement our security operations center, typically what organizations do first, they'll adopt the SIM and they'll say, great, I have a SIM, I can get all of these logs, and I can incorporate all these logs into any investigation. Great, good first step. Only problem is logs don't give you a lot of context, and there are a lot of logs out there, not to mention that cyber criminals are getting better at modifying these logs also. So we have all these logs that are coming in, but what's happening is that an organization says, well, okay, great, we have a SIM, what's the next step? We need to implement, we need some endpoint detection. We need something on the endpoint to make sure that we are getting visibility on the endpoints. Great. EDR is a must, just the same as SIM, 100% necessary for a mature security posture. But we had talked about this a little bit, especially when Mark had mentioned the fact that, we see manufacturing, construction industries, these verticals that sort of, they might not necessarily have visibility into some of the unmanaged devices that are on those networks. Things like those IoT systems, those SCADA systems for utility companies. They might not have visibility into these devices because there is no way to get an endpoint agent on those endpoints. So what do? You end up having a gap here. We call this the SOC visibility gap. So you can see there needs to be visibility into managed, unmanaged devices. You need visibility into all networks. You need visibility into all traffic, north, south, east, and west. So what happens, organization says, great, we'll implement a network detection and response tool. And this is where Gigamon comes in. So Gigamon's tool called Threat Insight is this network detection and response tool that allows you to see all of this data and really complete this security operations visibility triad so that you can get a handle on all of this network data traversing your network. Now, to the next point, great. You have all of this data. You've sort of completed your security operations center. You have all the visibility into the data that you need. How do you operationalize it? What do you need to do next? What does the threat hunter need to do? You need to be able to proactively hunt for threats on the network. So we will generate, Gigamon will generate alerts. And of course, we will generate alerts when something happens. But as attackers are getting more advanced, we know that they are becoming more adept at eluding these perimeter defenses that our organizations are putting up there. So what do? We need to train folks to be able to proactively hunt on their networks. They will know the network best. They know if Mark's machine shouldn't be talking to St. Petersburg, Russia at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. St. Petersburg time. They need to be able to detect these anomalous behaviors. So what is proactive hunting? Really what it is, it's just a means for your security operations professionals to formulate hypotheses and then to be able to research those hypotheses, conduct searches to be able to define whether or not that condition or that whatever's happening on the network is malicious or anomalous or not. If it's found to be normal behavior, what they'll do is they'll go back. They'll just start a new hypothesis. What's the next thing that I can look for? What's the next string I can pull on? If something is found to be real and there is a known threat or an unknown threat there that needs to be investigated more, what they'll do, they'll pivot, they'll expand the scope, they'll increase their, they will take a closer look at what's going on in the network. Maybe they'll expand their scope to multiple IPs on the network. Then this is when, once something is found to be an actual incident, this is when they will kick off the full incident response function, and then they'll develop new detections as a result. So this is what we're calling proactive hunting, but it is definitely it's a muscle that needs to be developed for any mature security posture when you're developing this mature security posture. So what does this look like sort of in the context of a security maturity curve, right? So where does proactive threat hunting fit in? Where does network detection response fit in? Where does the deep observability pipeline fit in? What I like to say is really what you have here is foundationally, you have this sort of deep observability pipeline down there at the bottom that spans a prevention, detection response, and extended detection response capability for your security operation. So first, you're going to have this sort of security operation center that's there for starting off your detection response capability. Next, what you're going to do is as you improve and as you create this incident response capability, this CERT program, what you're doing is now this is where the network detection and response comes in. This is where you're able to pull in all of that network telemetry, all the data that you need in order to detect this anomalous behavior on the network. Once you have a CERT developed, or a HERT, we've heard it, a HERT, CERT, goes under various names. But once you develop that incident response capability, then the next step in the maturity curve is really developing that fusion center that's blending your security operations with your CERT team and then creating an extended detection and response capability. And this is really where, when we talk about guided SaaS that you see there, this is where you are using your own team, your own security operations team, your CERT teams, your fusion teams, and you are then leveraging Gigamon's experts through our guided SaaS program, and you're bringing it all together into a fully sort of extended detection and response capability. We won't say XDR here, but we are mentioning that this is sort of part of a functional XDR capability. Now, that does it for me. I think Mark will be able to, maybe we bring Mark and Scott back on and we talk about questions or Q&A. Let's see here. All right,
yep,
Scott, what do you think?
Yep, great. Sounds good.
I will come back.
And yep, great. Okay. So that was a great discussion. I guess, Mark, one of the things that I always like to ask when somebody's compiled a report like of this volume is, what surprised you the most and the least from the results that you got?
Yeah. So let's do with most first. I think the how pervasive ZeroTrust is becoming, and the fact that it's actually happening to some extent. You know, I can recall back. I mean, ZeroTrust has been cooking since 2005 or thereabouts. So it's been a while, but now it's finally really taking off. So that was surprising to see the extent there. I was shocked, frankly, by the fact that user awareness and security education was, so far down the list of areas that organizations thought they needed to work on, given the fact that the human component continues to be such a big piece of so many security breaches. So that would be number two. And then, frankly, as much as we've heard about organizations complaining about complexity and how many tools they have, the fact that they are still not really prioritizing consolidation of their security tool set or not that interested in it, that was, again, a little bit surprising. Least surprising, I mentioned the whole quantification of risk and investment in security. Not surprised at all that the results there showed it is still an area needing a lot of attention and where the capabilities are kind of weak. And then also not particularly surprising, APIs and the focus that's being, or at least the acknowledgement that that's an area that needs more attention. I think that one's been cooking for the last couple of years, and not really surprised to see that at the top of the list either.
Interesting. Yeah, and I want to follow up on one of those quickly. Before I do that, I'm going to just go ahead and put up a poll here about additional information you'd like about the Gigamon solution. So we'll just let that run for a little bit so everybody gets a chance to answer it. But Mark, you and Chris got into this a little already, and then you just mentioned it, related point again, but Larry is asking the following. He says, every vendor has their own favorite package for protection. Is it better to change often or get more comfortable with your current packages? So what is your sense of CISO's attitude toward that from your survey research, as far as best of breed versus, really getting comfortable with the package, and not changing things up too much?
Yeah. I'll chime in first there. I think getting comfortable with the package makes good sense, with the caveat being that you trust the vendor to keep evolving that package, right? To keep evolving the security content that goes into it, and the capabilities that go into it. Not having to change out the training and the tool set on a regular basis is going to be beneficial, but only if the provider of that solution is bringing it forward for you constantly.
That's a good point. I think that
Gotcha.
It's easy to get sort of it's easy to go and say, yeah, we'll stick with we'll stick with the vendor. But to Mark's point, it is very important that you make sure that you have a vendor that is routinely either tuning or updating their solutions to make sure that it is keeping up with whatever, however varied the security landscape gets. And we all know how fast the security landscape evolves. So, making sure that you have a vendor that does keep up with that is, it's not a inconsequential thing to make sure that they are keeping up with that.
Okay, great. Next question comes from Paul, and Mark, this also gets to a point that you were making. Paul is wondering, do CISOs communicate these concerns or feel empowered to communicate them within their company's board and executive team? What's your sense of the attitude among CISOs about, their sort of their influence at the board level and the senior management level?
Yeah, I think there's been a tremendous change in that regard in the last 2 to 3 years. If you'd asked me before that time frame, I'd say that there was a lot of uncertainty and low confidence. But with the rise of ransomware and how how broad the impact of that was, how significant the impact of that was, boards took note, and as a result, security professionals, security leaders got a seat at the table because they had to explain all this to them. But that high profile nature, it opened the door to having that relationship, to building that relationship. And the point I was making during the presentation was that to continue that and to build on that door opening, I think the CISOs are going to have to figure out better ways to communicate with the board in terms that matter to them.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. On ZeroTrust, we got a couple of questions from Arvind about the definition, but that came in, Mark, before you were talking about ZeroTrust, and I think you gave a pretty good definition. So, Arvind, if there's some more clarification you'd like on that, just let us know in the chat. Chris, we got a question here from Cheryl, who's asking what features are included in the best ransomware defense services. And I wonder if you can address that sort of in the context of how ransomware is evolving and what are some of the best ways to stop it?
Sure. So, when we take a look at, so first, best ransomware defense solutions, right? We need to take a look at, obviously, ransomware has come a long way. We've started with, back in 1989, where ransomware was literally delivered in a manila envelope to people, and then they were asked to send a check to a PO box somewhere in, I think it was like Nebraska or someplace, to where we have now, where obviously with the rise of cryptocurrency, with the way to, with a true way to, almost true way to anonymously, issue payments and to accept payments, and we've come a long way, especially with the multiple extortions that are happening throughout the ransomware life cycle, et cetera. But I think the best way to deter ransomware is really, first, it's going to, way on the front end, it's going to start with something that Mark had mentioned with security awareness and education. You need to make sure that your teams are not clicking on these potential phishing links that are going to be sort of the initial vector into your organization. I think that's sort of foundational and fundamental. But if we look at, once the attacker is inside the organization, what happens then? The best tools are going to be able to tell you what's happening with that attacker once they're inside your organization. You need to have that comprehensive visibility. You need to have network telemetry to make sure that you can see, has there been lateral movement? Has there been privilege escalation? Have you seen data exfiltration? This is what's going to let you know, hey, there's someone doing something bad here. We need to be able to track this. Someone needs to be able to find this and be able to see and investigate what's going on in the network. So first, it starts with visibility, and that's from a network detection response side. But then you also, again, another thing that Mark had mentioned was, are you using encryption throughout your entire organization? So if you're doing that internally, you need to have a way to decrypt that data. You need to be able to make sure that you can decrypt and inspect that encrypted traffic to make sure that you aren't allowing this sort of blind spot, this pervasive blind spot to happen inside your organization. So I think it starts with visibility. It starts with visibility. Then the second step would be sort of encrypted data inspection. And then on the last part, you need to have the way to detect and respond to a threat once it's found. So it's sort of a three-pronged approach: visibility, encrypted traffic inspection, and detection and response at the end there.
Okay, great. Well, and Ned is actually asking you to bring that home. He's saying, explain how Gigamon's Hawk Deep Observability Pipeline extends your cloud security against potential ransomware attacks.
So sure, happy to do that. So what we're really doing is we are providing that full east-west visibility to what's happening on the network. So when I talk about a ransomware attacker, using lateral movement, using privilege escalation, exfiltrating data, we are providing detections and alerts on all of those instances to make sure that your security operations team knows that, oh, there's something happening here. We need to deal with that. And it's really helping address the ransomware problem before the ransomware has been, launched and detonated, and then your whole system is locked down. You want to make sure that you are encouraging your security operations team to find that malicious behavior well before the ransomware is actually launched. And that's what Gigamon does from an observability standpoint, from a TLS SSL decryption standpoint, and from a detection and response standpoint.
Okay. And, Mark, we've got a great question here from Bob, who's asking, I think success in this space is one part technology solutions, such as Gigamon, and one part CISO leadership skills. Based on your research and CISO insights, what are the 1 to 2 key leadership traits from CISOs that determine success in this critical security space?
Surround yourself with good, talented people and be able to inspire them and retain them. Certainly that's got to be at the top of the list. And then I think, it keeps coming back to it, communication, and that ties into both those people and that are working for you, and being able to communicate down to them what they need to get done, but communicating up, back to the board, so that you can represent the security team and get the resources you need to do the job properly. Those would be the top 2 on my list. I'm sure there's probably about another 20. You could probably write a whole book about this topic, but those are the 2 that popped in my mind right away.
Yeah. Tremendous. No, that's great advice. And it looks like we're running out of time. Chris Borales, if somebody wants to get started with Gigamon or find out more, what do you recommend?
Please visit the Gigamon website. You'll see some great resources there. We have a new sort of user experience page that really talks or shows how each of the Gigamon tools that I talked about today really plays into our ransomware defense. And I believe the website is gigamon.com/ransomware, and you can find out more about our ransomware solution there.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right, super. Well, there've been kudos in here from Cheryl and Howard and Naidu, among others. So just like to echo that. Gentlemen, great discussion. Really appreciate you coming on and talking about these fascinating topics with us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Okay. And oops, I'll put the poll back up, but I do want to get to our last piece of business for the day. And that is the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $300 Amazon gift card is Mike Wofford from Nevada. So congratulations to Mike. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Gigamon for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for all of the great questions today. That concludes this event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.